Happy day everybody, my name is Jeremy and this is Barbecue Elementary. And today I'll be smoking country style pork ribs on a pellet grill with a Boozy root beer float to pair. Let's go. This week I was hanging out around the pool with a friend who was saying he had some amazing pulled pork that was made with root beer. And it got me thinking, what can I make with root beer? What should I make with root beer? And so this week's video was born. I decided to use these bone-in country style ribs, which aren't really ribs in the first place. They're more accurately bone-in pork shoulder strips, but that's not very catchy to say. These are fun to use because they're cheap, super meaty, and can be cooked fairly quickly. However, they do have a tendency to dry out fairly quickly, so hopefully that's something I can avoid. I started off by patting these boneless pork shoulder strips dry and then went ahead to lay on a little seasoning. I decided to use yellow mustard as the binder and the barbecue rub from Killer Hogs as the rub. I'm still on the fence as to whether I think I get an advantage from using binders. Maybe it's just traditional for me at this point, but I am planning to do some blind comparison cooks soon to see if I can tell the difference. After being properly coated head to toe in mustard, it was time for the rub. This is maybe the most underrated rub out there, but it is perfect for nearly any cook and adds great color to any surface, even tables and cutting boards. Once they were nice and coated, it was time for me to get the pellet grill started. Except my grill was a big mess, so I'm going to clean it out, for educational purposes, and so my smoker doesn't get too nasty, and to avoid a huge fireball that could burn down my shack. So I took this handy dandy wood scraper to the grill grates first, which is smart to do because all the nasty bits will fall into the tin foil and be easier to pick up. Then I took the grates, the drip pan, and the heat baffle out of the Traeger to check out how ashy it was getting, and it was horrible. And I grabbed my wife's pride and joy, the Dyson, without asking, and sucked out all the ash I could. Pro tip, don't use a Dyson. Then I put all the inside bits back inside and laid down a new piece of foil onto the drip pan. And once the grate was back on, I gave the temperature probe a little bath with some grill safe cleaner and she was as good as new. When starting up, it's smart to smoke a little bit on the lowest setting with the lid open before preheating to clear out some of the old pellets from the fire pot. And once the grill was preheated to 250 degrees, it was time for the ribs to go on for about 2 hours.
2 hours later.
After 2 hours had elapsed and these things had put on a nice mahogany color, it was time for the second part of the cook, the wrap. Into the wrap, I put 1/4 cup of butter, 1/4 cup of light brown sugar, and to remain on theme for this video, 1/2 cup of mug root beer. At this stage of the cook, you can kind of do anything you want as long as it's mostly liquid and tastes good. Just don't get too weird and pour in some liqueur. Lastly, I dashed some apple cider vinegar, then tightly sealed up the tin with some foil and then threw it back onto the smoker for a few more hours or until the ribs get to about 200 degrees internal. Once the ribs were just a few minutes away from that target temperature, it was time for me to make a little mop liquid / glaze. All I did was add 1/4 cup of root beer, 2 tablespoons of honey, and 2 or 3 tablespoons of butter before I slid it onto the grill to warm up. After about 15 minutes or so, that sauce was warm and so were the ribs, so I took them out to go back onto the grates for a little glazing. This part's super simple. Once they were all lined up and back on the grill, I brushed on the sauce, closed the lid, and let them cook until it started to tack up. Every 5 minutes or so, I'd give them another layer, just building that sticky, glossy finish until they looked too good to wait any longer. During that process, I decided to make the Boozy root beer float, even though I forgot to push record. Nonetheless, all I did was add 2 ounces of this barrel-proof rye from Jack Daniel's into a glass. Then followed that up with 2 ounces of root beer and 4 small scoops of vanilla ice cream. Then I added 6 more ounces of root beer, gave it a quick stir, then topped it off with a little more root beer. And there you have it, my world famous spiked root beer, a super easy, boozy, frosty treat. Cheers. With the cocktail out of the way and the ribs up to temp and all sauced up, the cook was complete. The prep and cook for this was super easy, especially in the pellet grill, and I had a ton of fun playing with root beer as a recipe base. But now it was time to see how everything tasted. So, to give the ribs a grade, the color was amazing and they were really sweet and the glaze wasn't too overpowering. The only knock they do get is that they were a tad dry compared to spare ribs that cook all together. I knew that there was a little risk of this because there's so much more surface area, but it really wasn't the worst. But I had to take a few points off for that, so today they get a C. And for the spiked root beer, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. The rye I used is typically sweet already, even though it's such a high proof, and it played so well with the root beer and ice cream. This gets an A. So when you average all the scores together, this pair is a solid B, and I recommend you give it a try. And as always, thanks a million for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't to follow me along on my adventures through Barbecue Elementary.